Hello, everyone. Sorry for the brief delay in unmuting. Welcome to the second day of the Frontiers of Entrepreneurship Conference. It's great to have all of y'all back who participated yesterday, and wonderful to have those of you who may not have been there yesterday. So I'm Vicki Gibbs. I am the Executive Director for the Entrepreneurship Center at UNC Keenan-Flagler, and we are very excited to partner with Greg Brown and the Keenan Institute, as well as our academic partners and sponsors, to bring you this Frontiers of Entrepreneurship conference. We're also excited to partner with the Keenan Institute to bring you the Trends in Entrepreneurship report. We launched our second annual report yesterday, so if y'all have not downloaded it, I encourage you to do so. You can access it via the chat. I think Sydney's going to put a link in there, and you can also access it directly from the agenda. So we've tightly integrated the report and the conference this year. So as you are in a panel session, you can see on the agenda the exact section of the report that it refers to. So I encourage you all to dig in. So I'm going to introduce the conference today and talk to you about two things. The first thing I'm going to talk to you about is community. If you were in yesterday's session, you heard me talk about the fact that entrepreneurship is not a solo sport. But when it comes down to it, life isn't a solo sport. We exist in communities together to learn. One of my favorite quotes is, "As iron sharpens iron, so we sharpen each other." And that is the opportunity we have today here at the conference. So this is a really unique group of people that you'll be with today. We have people from academia, we have people from industry, and we have people from government and policy. And this conference brings us all together to talk about the most relevant issues in entrepreneurship. So I know we've all been in on a lot of Zoom meetings. People have become very efficient at multitasking during the Zoom meetings, but I really encourage you today to shut down the other things and lean in. You're going to be able to ask questions during each of the panel sessions with our Q&A feature. And you can also connect to the other people. So I do want to challenge y'all today to connect with one new person. Now you may wonder, well, how do I do that? I'm in Zoom. Well, we actually have a few opportunities for you. So at the end of today, we're actually going to be doing a networking session. And we're going to have two different Zoom rooms set up so that you can do small group discussions. And those small group discussions will be around the two panels today. So stay online, engage with others that way. If you're not able to do that, we also have a LinkedIn group for the Frontiers of Entrepreneurship Conference. And we're also communicating on Twitter. So our Twitter handle is #KIFE2021. So there are ways to connect, and I challenge you all to do so. So the second thing I want to talk about today really sets up our two panels today. And it's about the global pandemic that we are all still experiencing. Now, I don't want to minimize the negative impacts that the global pandemic has had. There have been lives lost, jobs lost, businesses closed. But there is also some good and opportunities that have come out of the past year. And two areas that have seen a tremendous amount of innovation and change are the two panels that we're covering today. The first one is health innovation. That one is led by Makamoan. And in that one, we've had all of the innovation with COVID research and the vaccine and delivery, but there's also been a whole host of innovation around data analytics and health, around AI and machine learning and how those are applied. So that is, I think, a great way for y'all to really sort of dig into what's going on and is being disrupted in the healthcare industry with some of our experts. Now, the second panel is looking at a second issue that we have all dealt with this past year, which is remote work. Now, with this shelter in place and everyone having to work remotely, we've had to learn new skills, right? And we've had to adapt as organizations. For entrepreneurs and for small businesses, this has provided a number of opportunities. So one example is a friend of mine who's actually a CEO of an ed tech company locally. He actually was looking for people, with ed tech experience, but that he was limited initially to this region or would have to relocate people. He's now started recruiting from across the US and can more quickly and with more depth fill those positions. Another example is a good friend of mine. She was just hired as an SVP of product for a growing blockchain company that is based in the Midwest. And so now she is a new executive team member that is working remotely. So we're seeing this trend that's happening across a lot of entrepreneurial businesses. And we're also seeing it in investments that they're not rooted to their regional location. So these are opportunities for entrepreneurs. And our second panel today is going to dig into those issues. So without further ado, I'm actually going to turn it over now to Maka Moen, who is one of our great professors here at UNC Kenan-Flagler, and she is going to lead us through this next panel. Take it away, Maka.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Vicky, for the introduction. My name is Mahka Moeen. I'm an associate professor of strategy and entrepreneurship here at the UNC's Kenan-Flagler Business School. I joined Vicky, Greg, and everybody in welcoming you to the Frontiers of Entrepreneurship conference. And we're so thrilled to have you with us today. As Vicky described, yesterday was an amazing day of learning and reflection on a number of different topics. And as we kick off day 2 of the conference, I hope that we can continue with the same energy and spirit of learning and action. So I'm pleased to introduce our panel for today, Health Analytics and Entrepreneurship. For those of you who are conference veterans or newcomers, you may know that one of the recurring themes of our conference is emerging technologies. And every year we pick one particular technology and have a spotlight on it. And this year our focus is on health innovations. Of course, the rapid pace of technological innovation has opened a new era of wellness and medical treatment for all of us. But as Vicky alluded to, the sober reality of our global community going through a pandemic in the past year is not lost on us either. And throughout the past year, time and time again, our communities were filled with hope and power as we heard about various technological innovations in healthcare. But if we reflect back and look at history, these are not exceptions. This has been actually the rule in the area of medical innovation. As we look at the COVID vaccine being one of the quickest vaccines to have been introduced, we can think about other public-private partnerships throughout the history that have brought us other amazing medical drugs. As an example, during the World War, after realizing the immense need for having infection treatments, the government put through the OSRD a program to deliver the next medical drug that we're now benefiting from today, the penicillin. The news that we heard from hospitals, that doctors and healthcare providers were tweaking ventilators to be able to increase their effectiveness and scale in health delivery is again nothing new. This is what doctors have been doing every day at the front line of innovation in medical devices, leveraging the knowledge that they've had with respect to how those devices can be refined and improved. They have been the user innovators and entrepreneurs in that era. And I know we're all cheering that Merck and Johnson & Johnson put their competition aside and they're helping with the manufacturing of the vaccine. That is, again, have been a pillar of healthcare and medical innovation. Collaborations have been the norm in the industry. And indeed, many of the benefits that we're getting is the result of that. So with all of this, as we're cheering and celebrating many of the achievements that have actually gave us power and hope over the past year, we decided to use the opportunity to have healthcare as the spotlight for this year. The particular focus of our panel is on health analytics, but as you all know, like alongside with all of these panels and conference sessions, we're releasing this year's Trends in Entrepreneurship report, and it has a special segment on health innovations, generally not like limited to health analytics. So let me walk you through some of the most interesting and exciting trends that we actually observed there. And I invite you to check the report at much more length because we have many more like other issues there. So I'll share my screen. Okay. So we have been looking at healthcare industry from two perspectives: medical devices and pharmaceuticals as like two different pillars of the industry. And of course, throughout the past couple of decades, as we look at the share of healthcare spending in general in the economy, this has been an increasing share. So this is no surprise that healthcare innovation has also received a lot of attention. One of the trends that we do see coming up until 2020 is that health tech startups are receiving really high levels of private capital investment. And with the SPACs being the most recent way to capture economic value out of these opportunities, those are also becoming very important. So to look at some of the private funding trends in healthcare, this has been an increasing trend, as I said, very much relying on private funding. But regardless of this vibrant increase in spending in this area, it looks like that health tech unicorns actually are looking at exit options through SPACs and not necessarily IPOs or the traditional ways. Putting aside the financial and funding trends in this area, the nature of innovation outcomes in this area is also very important. One of the things that we can look at is like the vibrancy and the general side of pharma industry in particular, that has accounted for 10% of overall R&D spending in the economy, with an increasing trend roughly 3% annually. And you look at the revenue that's been generated in this industry, $205 billion, again, on an annually increased trend. And looking at where this revenue is really coming from and what those R&D expenditures are really leading us, looking at the number of patents that have been filed in the area of pharmaceutical drugs, we do see a pretty steady rise in the past decade. But there has been some sort of bump and a decrease around the time of the recession in 2008, but thankfully a great recovery after that. And this maps nicely into how actually research collaborations in the biopharmaceutical industry have also trended. We did have a very healthy level of collaborations before the recession of 2008. And again, the slowness that we experienced in those years had a great comeback. And these trends are particularly important because if you think about the outputs of biopharmaceutical industry being the drugs that are introduced into the market, research collaborations and patents are really lead indicators of where the industry is going on. Many of these collaborations are where companies get together, share their resources and technologies with the hope to offer new products. And then those patents are really the foundational building blocks of potential molecules and processes that are then embedded in introduced pharmaceutical drugs. So if we don't have these leading indicators, then it's very difficult to see drugs later introduced in the market. So these are all very promising trends. Now, looking at some of the outputs with respect to drug pipeline and drugs that are currently under development within pharmaceutical companies, there has been a steady growth, even though probably a lot of these drugs in development will not go through stage 2, stage 3 clinical trials, but this vibrancy is really pointing to the health of the system overall. And looking at therapeutic areas that have been the focus of the pharmaceutical industry in general, we do see a pretty distributed attention towards many of the therapeutic areas, with a particular area being anti-cancer drugs receiving a lot of attention, and second being neurological therapeutic area. So that's interesting that these two areas have received the majority of attention with respect to drugs in development. But what these numbers are masking really is another very important trend that's happening in the background. And that is three methods of drug discovery and development that have been introduced in the past decade: AI-driven drug discovery, CRISPR gene editing, and mRNA vaccines. And I want to highlight this for one particular reason, because yes, we can count the number of drugs that are introduced into the market. We can count the number of patents and look at those increasing trends. But these are really methods of drug discovery that if we can see any type of revolution and change in them, then the accelerated rate of drug discovery will come after them. These are methods that can act as multiplier effects throughout the system. And we have seen some of the historical trends in the past, where in the late 1970s, recombinant DNA technology brought the biotechnology revolution and really shifted the pattern of drug discovery from chemistry-based experimentation to real understanding of recombinant DNA. We did see a lot of new drugs, a lot of therapeutic areas that did not receive attention beforehand really come to surface. And these three trends that we have here as enabling technologies as really methods of drug discovery gain importance in that spirit. And if you want to look at a couple of them, let's say AI-driven drug discovery, actually investments in AI are now receiving like the bulk of the attention. Respect to all the areas that you're being invested, healthcare is really front and center. And some of the major achievements to cheer, we've probably heard stories of AlphaFold or the CASP system out of universities coming in that have really revolutionized the way we think about drug discovery and how effective these new methods are. Along that, CRISPR gene editing is this other enabling technology that came out of that was actually rewarded with a Nobel Prize in the last year, which is amazing. And you do see from the numbers here on screen in terms of how vibrant both the upfront, like scientific discoveries, like publications and patents are, and then on downstream, like practitioner side of it, how many companies and clinical trials are currently going on in this area. And as we're all benefiting from mRNA vaccine development, of course, this is another very exciting area that has the potential to shift the way we think about vaccines moving forward. The other sector in healthcare is medical devices. Another quick glance about this industry again shows very healthy trends with respect to investments and fundings that this has been received. Again, innovation, the rate of patent applications had seen a similar slump thinking about the recession years, but had a quick recovery afterwards. Similarly, collaborations in the medical devices sector, similar to pharmaceuticals, have seen a similar comeback after the recession. Two other charts that I want to direct your attention to relates to medical device approvals and what we see. In the US, there are two categories of medical device approval. One are for refinements to existing models. That's the one you see here on the left of the screen. And we did see a decreasing trend there. But to the extent that it relates to class 3 devices that you see on the right side of the screen, the numbers are going up, and these are really the novel medical devices that are introduced in the market. And all of you, with respect to the enabling technologies that are changing medical devices, I'm now wearing my Apple Watch. Many of the other attendees here may be using and benefiting from different digital trends and connectivity in this area again, which are promising trends that have the potential to really shift the landscape here. So with this, I hope that I've gave you a very overall general view of where the trends in the healthcare sector is going. Again, I invite you and encourage you to check the report. There are many more trends listed and documented and actually interpreted there. With this background, let's have our spotlight and check on health analytics as a particular area that has been receiving a lot of attention and has actually helped healthcare providers and firms to reimagine the workflow of providing healthcare in the society. And John Field who is here with us, will lead this session as the moderator. Dr. Feld, I'd like to introduce him first as an alumni of the University of North Carolina. Then after which he has moved to become a professor of strategy, entrepreneurship, and philosophy at the Duke University. And John is currently the Director of Innovation and Entrepreneurship Initiative at Duke, which is a university-wide initiative to really increase collaborations between student, faculty, and other stakeholders in this area. John, we are privileged to have him on the panel, given the immense expertise, not just on the academic side and his knowledge on that area, but the deep expertise and experience in leading entrepreneurs himself in healthcare and beyond. So John, the virtual stage is yours. Thank you.
Maka, thank you so much. It is such a great pleasure to be with you and to be with everyone. And first, I have to say thanks to you and to Chris and to everyone for putting together this report. I think it's such an excellent piece of work and a wonderful contribution to our field. So I really encourage everyone to take a look at it. It truly is a great piece of work. And also thanks to Vicki and Greg and everyone for organizing this conference. You know, we miss being together in Florida, but done a great job and really appreciate it. You know, we all know that data analytics, machine learning, et cetera, is exploding and coming into so many parts of our lives, but nowhere is there the potential for more impact than in healthcare, how healthcare is delivered, access to healthcare, tailoring of healthcare. So this is such an important topic for all of us, and especially those of us involved in innovation and entrepreneurship. I think we have a terrific panel today, people with different perspectives and different views on this. So I'll introduce the panel very quickly, and then we'll have brief remarks from each of the panelists, followed by a little dialogue, and then we'll open it up for general Q&A. So our panel is Aaron McKethan, who is General Manager of New Ventures at Adelaide and Senior Policy Fellow at the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy, which is one of our sister organizations at Duke. Welcome, Aaron. Jillian Munson is the Chief Financial Officer at Iora Health and a venture partner at Union Square Ventures. Then Faye Cobb-Payton is the Professor of Information Technology and Analytics at North Carolina State University. So we have all the, or most of the universities represented. And finally, Brad Stotz is a Professor of Operations and the Faculty Director of the Center for the Business of Health at UNC's Keenan Flagler Business School. We are going to begin with some observations from Brad, who is going to set up one of the problems to be addressed potentially by analytics. Then we'll move to Jillian, whose company is trying to take advantage of data analytics to deliver healthcare in a new model. And then we'll get some comments from Faye and Aaron, some cautionary words on the application of data. So I think that should be very interesting, and then we'll see where the dialogue goes. So without further ado, Brad, please maybe introduce yourself a little more fully than I did, and then what do you have for us?
Sure. Thanks, John. And thanks, Maka, Greg, Vicki, everybody for organizing. I am Brad Stotz, faculty here at Keenan Flagler, lead the Center for the Business of Health, and spend a whole lot of time thinking about really learning in healthcare. And today, as John mentioned, I want to talk a little bit about what I see as a fundamental challenge in healthcare that I think analytics, innovation, entrepreneurship are all necessary for us to move forward. So, Maka mentioned kind of the incredible success of the COVID vaccination, COVID vaccine discovery process, right? In December, the US FDA approved the Pfizer COVID vaccine. With this action, the world had its first approved vaccine. 1 week later, we had our second with Moderna's approval. And both of these vaccines far exceeded our initial expectations, right? With efficacy greater than 90%. And these were incredible innovations that were really a testament to the hard work and ingenuity of numerous individuals and organizations. Yet 1 month later, despite the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic continued to have a meaningful health economic impact on the world and on the US, fewer than 5 million people in the US had actually received a vaccination. And this rocky rollout was not due to a lack of time, right? Vaccine candidates had been progressing through the discovery and testing pipeline for months. When attention shifted from creating remarkable new healthcare to delivering it, the system stumbled. And I want to suggest that this is a core problem that we face in healthcare today that I would label delivery neglect, that we focus on the treatment and we ignore how it's delivered, and that this is pervasive in US healthcare. And that healthcare in the US is really a study in contrasts, that patients across the world who can afford to do so, rush to US institutions, such as many of our own or others like the Mayo Clinic or Cleveland Clinic or Hopkins, in order to have complicated, almost impossible to cure ailments get addressed. And whether this is due to investments in technology or employing the best and brightest clinicians and researchers, much of American healthcare is rightfully considered world-class. If you look at our cancer survival rates as an example, they're some of the highest in the world. But while it's true that many of our healthcare organizations do a great job at this frontier of medicine, performance looks far worse in the overall context of care. Despite the fact that our per capita healthcare spending far exceeds the rest of the world at around 18% of GDP, health outcomes in the US often lag those in other much lower spending nations. US life expectancy at birth, for example, trails 25 other OECD countries. And mortality trails 28 other OECD countries. Whether it's skyrocketing obesity rates, incidence of diabetes, cost of various surgical procedures, the US healthcare system is too often delivering subpar quality at a high cost. And so like many things in healthcare, delivery neglect, the good news is it's a condition that can be treated and perhaps even cured, right? But for us to do that, we first need to understand it, which I want to talk about very briefly, and then start to explore how do we do better, which I think this panel is going to be a great way to do that. I would highlight kind of 4 drivers around why delivery neglect occurs, and I think innovation and analytics are going to help on each of these. I'd use the acronym SICK to capture it, so S-I-C-K. First, we've got status differentials in innovators and innovations between healthcare and delivery. That traditionally those who create the new product innovations are rewarded with higher status. Those who focus on the delivery that get into the data are often seen as second-tier participants, and yet they can fundamentally drive the experience. The I incentive misalignment, we can think about fee for service. We've got short-term payment approaches. We've got a lack of measurement, at least those latter analytics well suited to address. Third, we have the complexity of healthcare, whether that's the human body, healthcare being nested in social systems, right? Social determinants of health, drivers of health, complex healthcare system design, all things that analytics can help us unpack and really understand, what are those key determinants that are going to help us get delivery right. And then finally, knowledge asymmetry and gaps, whether that's just the difference in the immense training that professionals get, part of it, but also, individuals know their situation, know what they want, know their bodies, and how do we capture that information and bring that in? How do we improve the transparency of quality and cost and help people understand cause and effect, all things that analytics potentially can help us address. So when we think about kind of dealing with that problem of sick, dealing with delivery neglect, there's a chance to really take advantage of the confluence of technology, consumerism, and analytics to help us deliver digital solutions, to offer strategies to help organizations really leverage these approaches to care delivery. Want to suggest that kind of thinking new in terms of partnership. Some of it will be entirely new organizations stepping into delivery. A lot of it's going to be our existing players partnering in new ways. So we can think about kind of a triangle. How do we forge new partnerships between existing providers in healthcare, new entrants, be they entirely new startups, be they the Amazons, the Best Buys, the Walmarts of the world who are doing a whole lot. And then finally, patients, the consumers, right? And if you build that triangle out, how do we think about ways to support them, to understand them better, to innovate, and eventually, right, tying all of this through kind of the data, what's the story telling us? So with that, let me kick it back to you all excited for our discussion.
Brad, thanks very much. Jillian, that was very thoughtful. Jillian, how are you addressing these issues?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Jillian Munson. I'm the CFO at Iora Health. And, a lot of what Bradley was talking about is very relevant for us. So for those of you who don't know Iora, we are a primary care provider. And we focus on the Medicare Advantage population and increasingly direct Medicare as well. Our business was founded 10 years ago by a doctor who believed that people were really undervaluing the power of primary care. And our view is that proactive, high-touch primary care can significantly reduce cost over the longer term in healthcare. And so our business has been based around that concept. The people have tried these things before. And our view has always been that having excellent data analytics and an understanding of populations on a larger scale basis can really help us make that primary care really be powerful. When I think about Iora, one of the stats that really sticks out to me is that our patients end up in the hospital 40% less than the Medicare standards. And we think that's really powerful for two reasons. One is a cost issue, which I'll come back to in a sec. And the other is that our patients don't want to be in the hospital. They want to be with their families. They want to be enjoying their lives. And so we view it as our job to help them from a primary care perspective, do the things every day, the easier small things you can do every day to keep you out of the hospital longer term. For sure, our patients end up in the hospital when they need to be in the hospital, when there's a real medical need. But our role is around helping them live a healthier life, which in our experience, and now I'll get to the data, and then I'll come back to cost in a second, is about figuring out what leads to a healthier life. And at Iora, what we have found is frequent interaction. We interact with our patients 19 times a year versus the average out there of about 4 to 6 times a year for these types of patients. We really believe that mental health matters. Our data shows that when we're engaging with patients in person and with mental health capability, it significantly reduces their downstream use of the system. And so when we started our company, and in terms of how we invest in our company, I will say, I shouldn't say we so much, I've been at the company since January, but some of the first employees the company hired were technologists and data scientists to make sure that we're looking at data and using data to make this both a sustainable business and a business that really serves patients. And our tag, the way we talk about our company, is restoring humanity to healthcare. But underneath that is a very important data asset to help us understand both how to make that happen in an effective way to reduce costs and also to make our patients happier. Just in terms of cost, and this is just rough numbers to give you a sense of how this works, our average patient typically is delivering revenue to us of about $1,000, a little under $1,000 per member per month. One hospitalization is on average at a minimum $10,000. So if you're making $12,000 a year to take care of a patient, you're seeing them 19 times a year. They likely have other medical care that's happening in addition. That one hospitalization starts to significantly eat into your ability to pay to see them 19 times a year. If they go back a second time, you're now losing money on that patient. And so there's also an economic issue here of hospitalizations, which I'm focusing on here. There's lots of other examples, but hospitalizations in particular are so expensive for this category. And again, our main goal is to provide wholesome 360 primary care that gets people healthier so they're not using the system. And we're keeping them with their families, living in a lifestyle that they would prefer versus in and out of the hospital. So that's essentially how we think about the business. Implicit in our business is a very important data asset that we are constantly looking at to make sure we understand what trends are. Coming out of COVID is a whole new world for us, and understanding, what are the statistics around when we see patients, how soon after they've been hospitalized or have had an outside of our four walls medical appointment, how often do we see them? We look at this data all the time looking for a new insight into how we can provide better care. And then we deliver insights to our care teams to help them understand how to do the very human interaction with their patients every day in the field. So that's Iora, a little bit of a snapshot of Iora and what our approach is, just in terms of the realm of the, multi-trillion-dollar market that is healthcare. Primary care is a very tiny drop in the bucket cost-wise of the overall health care system. And yet we think it's one of the most powerful places to start with patients. And when we all think about the business, we think about what is the primary care we'd want our parents to have. I think about it in terms of what my parents would have, but I also increasingly in my own experience think about what I would want to have in terms of a primary care team that really understands all aspects of my life and is helping me manage my overall care over time so I can live my best life too. So thank you. That's Iora, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jillian. Very interesting approach. Now we'll move over to Faye to give us her thoughts on the use of data in healthcare delivery. So please, Faye, take it away.
Thank you, John. And thanks for having me here today. I just want to piggyback off of something that Jillian mentioned, which was primary care being a central focus, which I think I applaud you for that work. What is interesting to me, I'll make an observation, is that when we looked at the trends report in healthcare, there were two foci. One was on medical devices and one was on pharma. Neither was on primary care, right? And so I think that sort of centers where this whole business of analytics is going. And just to give you this backdrop, a few years ago, some colleagues of mine at NC State, we did a study. We did a study and we looked at health disparities, and we decided that we did not want to look at health disparities individually. However, we wanted to see how did comorbid conditions manifest themselves. And so I think analytics, and particularly this AI world that we're moving in, we are going to have to look at how conditions cling together to tell a story. Our story was we were really interested in how did this data manifest itself to show patients' involvement with mental health services and those services for patients that were living with HIV. And we were looking at length of stay and cost of care. And what we learned was that having mental disorders generally resulted in a lower cost in both length of stay and total charges. But patients with mental illnesses are more likely to be transferred to other facilities. And what's the story in here? And the story of the analytics, as we said, was actually length of stay will not be observed. This dovetails with sort of these recent, I'd say, studies that are taking place, particularly when it looks at how are we building algorithms and what do algorithms tell us about race and racism in healthcare. And I think this is an important aspect because there are structural inequities that are built in. And I think Brad mentioned the social determinants of health. And beyond the social determinants of health, we recognize that oftentimes race has been excluded, or we've had race-blind algorithms, which may be well-intended, but unfortunately, they do not necessarily yield the results that will create disparate or non-disparate conditions and desirable health outcomes. The omissions of race and racial experiences are twofold. And this has been well documented in the literature, particularly in recent findings by Time in its special issue on healthcare, that oftentimes when the algorithm is intended to be race blind, then you actually do more harm in a number of ways by not providing the services or making decisions based on proxies. What I would suggest is this issue of precision medicine, personalized healthcare, there's going to be a need for developing algorithms that understand context, both the clinical side, but also the historic side, because healthcare does not happen in a vacuum. Healthcare is about an ecosystem of education, of housing, of employment, and understanding those conditions within the analytics. Some call it small data, because right now analytics is built off big data, big data, big data. There is a need for some recognition of small data in the paradigm, in the context of developing healthcare applications. And then particularly if you're going to be entrepreneurial, you're going to need to have that skill set on your team. And oftentimes I find that with students, they can write great algorithms, they can run great analytical models, but until you understand the context of healthcare, the solutions and the innovation will be absent of meeting the needs of a target or any target population. And so with that, I would just end with saying this. I appreciate the SICK model, Brad. I appreciate the SICK model. I think in the SICK model, the incentives is something that really, when we're talking about managed care and we're talking about fee for service, understanding those nuances beyond and how it impacts beyond medical devices and pharma, we're going to really have to think about what is the innovation at the patient level besides the wearable, because not all patients are connected in such a way that will enable them to have data that can inform the analytics and then also inform an AI development. So I'll turn it back over to John.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just, before I turn it to Aaron, I think that your point that using data is great, but the data doesn't tell us what data to use. And that requires a different level of thinking and intelligence. I really appreciate you putting that point on the table for us. So thank you very much. Let me now turn it to Aaron for his thoughts.
Well, thank you very much. And this is a well-designed sequence of speakers because I want to simply add to what Jillian said and add to what Faye just said and with some additional examples. I am in week 3 of a new role as general manager of new ventures at Aledade. And so I'll reflect a bit on that as well as on 2 prior data science startups that are very much practitioners of the very exciting use of data and analytics in healthcare. Aledade is a company that helps independent primary care practices be more successful in value-based care arrangements. As Jillian said, we need a much more robust primary care infrastructure in this country. And our role in it is to really help small independent practices band together and learn best how to use tools and technologies and clinical expertise to help them earn more money and produce better outcomes for their patients and really serve their community. 75% of our practices are in rural America, and we view it as part of our mission to really bolster the healthcare infrastructure in local places like my hometown of Boone, North Carolina. It's often the small practices, small independent healthcare entities that are employers and that are innovators and that are really key to helping communities thrive. Two quick context points for the other companies I referenced. I'm the co-founder of a company called RxAnti, which uses, still around, but I'm no longer there, uses healthcare claims data to predict whether patients will take their medicine. You can think of the use cases here, the extraordinary effort to produce a new medicine that has been demonstrated to be effective and efficacious for patients. As former Surgeon General C. Everett Koop said, however, patients that don't take their medicines don't benefit from them. And so RxAnti uses a variety of methods to predict and use those predictions to in turn inform the allocation of clinical resources earlier in the therapeutic process to avoid patient discontinuation of their meds as appropriate and support them through the process rather than waiting until they quit and then trying to talk them back into therapy. You can imagine the use cases in certain areas like schizophrenia and other behavioral health related conditions, but also some of the kind of core chronic diseases that affect so many Americans. Half of folks prescribed a statin take it on time or take it at some level across the year, over the year. There's a lot of work we can do to just get better value from the medicines that we already have. Data and analytics really played a role in that. Second company, Novisci, more recently, is a company in Durham, North Carolina that was just acquired this past December. But my colleague, Alan Burkhart, is an epidemiologist, and I brought this company to the market to try to help, again, another data science company that tries to make it more efficient to deploy advanced epidemiological methods to the practical real world of healthcare. So if we want to learn things like, which drug performs better for a given subpopulation with methods as rigorous as those that you'd see that Alan, epidemiologists would publish in a paper, how do we generate tools? How do we build tools that make it possible for those in healthcare delivery to have that kind of rigorous information available to them, not just once, but as data update, recurringly. When I served as chief data officer at North Carolina Medicaid, it always struck me that of how much data we have in Department of Health and Human Services, and yet how little of it is easily accessible to those of us trying to make informed decisions or policy changes. A very simple example: to know what percentage of Medicaid recipients with opioid use disorder are not receiving buprenorphine or other relevant treatments at the clinically indicated duration of therapy can help us figure out how to help those patients. But we don't have that information. To get that information, we would tend to outsource an expensive study to an academic outfit, and they would spend 12 months doing it, and we'd have a really exquisite PDF at the end, but not a document that we can use recurringly to learn what works to improve the outcome we care about. So that's what Novisci was about. So a couple comments, just putting all those three experiences together briefly that I'd like to share. One, there's incredible hope to use the data in healthcare more effectively. I think we all agree that the data healthcare is data rich. The challenge, though, that I've seen is that we have in the health analytics business, the sector has become more enamored with the methods, the tools, than with the questions that are intended to be solved. So it's almost like, we're excited about the screwdriver, and our job is to go find something to use that screwdriver for, as opposed to trying to clarify what's the problem. What's the problem that what's the question we're trying to answer? What's the problem we're trying to solve? And what's the method that most efficiently solves that problem? Sometimes it's deep learning. Deep learning, AI, these are the kind of important innovations that show real promise in healthcare, but they're more likely to be the subject of headlines about healthcare analytics than what I actually prefer, which is simple counting. A lot of our problems in healthcare are counting problems. That example I just gave you about opioid use disorder is really a counting problem. How many people meet the following criteria and also meet the next criteria? It is remarkable to me how challenging it is in healthcare to get simple counting questions answered. And we don't need really fancy algorithms to do that. We need people who can identify the right questions, think about the policy decisions being made or the business decisions being made, and craft the kinds of questions that will best inform those decisions, and then use whatever methods best answer that. We shouldn't get extra credit for methodological innovation when we really don't need it all the time. When my dad this came to light for me when I was a caregiver to my father, my late dad, who was diagnosed with late stage lung cancer many years ago. Here I am, UNC trained, lots of focus on health policy and data science. And so I've kind of had some assumptions built into the experience of being my dad's son in that experience. We get to my mom and my dad and I sat and heard the diagnosis. And right away, dad is put on kind of a conveyor belt for various times of intervention, chemotherapy and so on. And by no means was I questioning the expertise of the clinicians when I asked this, but I wanted to know this question. And the background of the question, I'll tell you in a second. The background of the question was, I really want dad in his last year of life to be able to hang out with his brother at the beach. I really wanted them, while he's healthy, to be able to do that. So my question to the clinicians was, what percentage of patients like dad, 65-year-old, Medicare, white, former smoker, pretty common lung cancer, stage 4 diagnosis, what percentage of patients like my dad get any kind of chemotherapy in his shoes? And it wasn't that I was trying to inform a particular strategy for chemo or anything like that. I just want to know, is it 2%? Is it 20%? Is it 80%, right? I don't need a lot of precision to help us with this, but I wanted to know, is this worth pushing on a little? Is this the point where we ask, is this the right strategy for dad if we're trying to optimize the quality of life? The reason I share that example in the context of a data analytics discussion is because there was no answer to that question. The clinicians don't have the tools to answer that kind of information. They can tell me what happened in the last 10 patients, but those are anecdotal stories. We have not organized our healthcare data into something that is suitable for answering very simple questions. The other reason I raised that example, personal example, is that question doesn't require sophisticated deep learning and other algorithms. It doesn't require, artificial intelligence. It requires organizing the data, crafting the right question. And by the way, the data are there. Like every health plan would have, every health plan would have this information, assuming they have enough demographic and clinical data to identify patients who are stage 4 in my dad's case. But this was the big insight for me in this field, is that we need to be more humble about the methods and more robust about the questions. And we'll find is sometimes deep learning is important. If we're trying to sort out, 10,000 lab results, and we need an efficient algorithm to help us detect patterns, then simple counting won't do. But a lot of our questions in healthcare are really don't require that level of sophisticated tool. And I think we've got a systematic bias to the more sophisticated, when I think we can make a lot of progress to help a lot of patients if we just use good old-fashioned counting and reward those who help develop an innovation or research that results in informing an actual decision rather than deploying a fancy algorithm that may or may not be useful. So that's not me saying I'm not supportive of advancements in more rigorous analytical innovation. Of course I am. But I think what has dawned on me is we are a healthcare-rich system and a knowledge-poor system. And we can start by getting really clear. If you're starting a company, you need to know what are the questions that are going to make a difference to a business owner. They don't care that you're using a sophisticated algorithm. They want to know, is this going to make me more money? Is this going to lower my cost? Is this going to improve access to customers? Those are the kind of things. And often it's very simple counting questions that can do the job. So hopefully that gives you a mix of both the hope of health analytics, the need for it, but also to push back a bit on the hype. I don't hear that hype today at all, by the way. I'm not commenting on anyone's previous comments, but more the state of the industry and where it's headed.
Aaron, thank you. Thank you very much.
Sure.
And I think we are moving toward a general discussion, but let me first thank all our panelists for their comments. And I really appreciate sort of a common theme that is emerging from different perspectives. You know, as we heard at the beginning, we live in the country with some of the most sophisticated healthcare in the world, with some of the, if not the top hospitals, healthcare institutions, and we have among the worst healthcare outcomes among developed nations because of some of the issues that are being discussed in this panel. And I appreciate that everyone is really the underlying theme is the inequity that's inherent in our healthcare system, and how do we use data as well as our motivation to really improve healthcare in this in the country we live in and in the world. And I think data can play a role, assuming we follow some of the advice that both Faye and Aaron have given us, and think about, I think, the very helpful framework that Brad put on the table for us. So let me just pause for a moment and ask any of our panelists if they'd like to add any thoughts to the discussion we've had so far, maybe going back to some of the earlier discussants and hearing the notes of warning from both Aaron and Faye.
You know, one thing that I think about a lot, and we think about a lot, is what is it going to mean to work in healthcare over time? You know, we're talking about these, you know, auto magical data sets that are going to make decisions easier. And kind of to Faye's point as well, you know, what does it mean to be on the front lines working with patients? Because we don't believe that this is going to be a world where patients only talking to a computer. They're going to be talking to computers and humans. And, you know, what does it mean to be one of those people? The way folks have been trained in the past, you know, is not necessarily to be a data science expert. And yet there's all this data science coming at them. And so one of the things we think about a lot is what's going on at the educational level. How are people getting the right training? How do we make this transition to in a data rich environment and yet keep, you know, we use the word humanity a lot, but how do you keep the humanity in the care itself? And so I think this is going to bring all new constructs to what it means to be in med school and how you get trained, or not even just med school, but even nurses and all of the other practitioners we use, coaches, et cetera, in our practices, to get them in the right frame of mind where data can be an asset and not an overwhelming problem. Because what we see is it's extremely hard to hire people right now. People are in great demand. They're also overwhelmed. It's just taking care of folks is overwhelming in itself. And then being asked to be a data scientist on the side is tricky. And so we think about that a lot. I don't think we have any answers yet, but we really are trying to think about what does that mean as we get a larger and larger workforce in this space.
Right.
Yeah.
Faye, please.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, you raise a great question about what does that mean from an educational perspective. And I recently served as a judge for AI sort of startups, right? And seeing what was being done in that healthcare space within those startups. What was striking to me is very, very, very smart computer science statisticians, but there was still this lack of domain knowledge. And we're going to have to rethink how, particularly if we're talking about training data scientists for a healthcare space, you need domain knowledge. When Brad says to you, fee for service, your student will need to know what fee for service is. And secondly, I would say, while the algorithms may be growing, and I definitely agree with Aaron, sometimes random walk is just the best way to go. I remember my professor saying that many years ago. You know, we did all of this work and to prove that the random walk model was actually the best model. In other words, take the averages and be done, right? And so in this space, what we should really consider is that when we have multiple people, multiple experts from different backgrounds solving a problem, it's going to have to be a team approach to these issues. But the entrepreneurship piece that I was looking at, again, very striking, very smart, very statistical oriented, very computer science, lots of engineers, but still lacking in that domain knowledge. and where healthcare is going and where it has come from.
I'd love to tap real quick, John, on something both tying to what Faye said and to Aaron. I think, one of the really big kind of comments is this, what problem are you trying to solve? And I think that it's one, as we look at a lot of where innovation and entrepreneurship is happening now, is on very narrow problems that we need to have a question answered, but that it actually, to Faye's point about some of the complexity and looking at the coordination, that it ends up making it worse. And so this is a complaint I've heard from a number of payers, for example, talking about like digital health,
Right.
that there's an app for everything now. And by itself, that seems like a good idea until you realize that a patient, that has, several comorbid conditions and is trying to manage things more broadly, can't possibly move across that entire space. And so I think if we go back to Aaron's kind of fundamental question, right? What problem are we really trying to help people with? And I think it ties to how Jillian told the story of anchoring things in primary care. Right.
Mhm.
Then you have kind of that, coordinator stretching across all of these elements. And it's part of this challenge as we think about, the opportunity going forward, that data can answer these individual pieces. But then as we try to innovate, as we try to create the new ventures, how do we knit them together so that we make it better for patients or for anyone in the system, providers as well, rather than actually making their lives worse in this process?
That is a great point, Brad. And I love the fact that there's this consistent theme of focusing on the real issues, the practical issues, being driven by the problems to be solved, the questions to be answered, rather than falling in love with the algorithms of the technology, which I very much appreciate. I wonder, we have a couple of questions. Let me, there's a question for you, Jillian, that I think is an interesting question for your venture, and in general, for those entrepreneurial ventures that are tackling this problem of creating greater access, higher quality, higher equity in our health system, and how have you thought about that at Iora? And then possibly Aaron, as an investor, how you think about the returns for investment given some of the environment that we live in, the institutional factors, the incentives, et cetera, because it's not necessarily optimized for the model of healthcare that people on this panel are talking about. So Jillian, to you first, please, and then Aaron, maybe you can give your thoughts.
It's hard to comment on everyone's financials in this space, and I've been at Iora since January. So pardon if I don't know every company, every name, every cash flow, but these are big investment businesses for sure. These businesses are going to take hundreds of millions of dollars. And the issue is one of scale, because ultimately with third-party medical expense, which is essentially our cost of goods sold in a way, is going to be high no matter what population you're looking at here. And so these are fundamentally low margin businesses, which means you have to have scale. So at least when I look at it from an Iora perspective, for us, while we've been around for 10 years, we've really been scaling this model for probably about 4 or 5 years or so. And when I look at our patients who've been with us for 3 and 4 years, I feel very good about what the cash flows look like for them. We just need more of them in our mix. And so one of the things that happens in these businesses, the more you grow, the more money you lose. Because when you first get a patient, adherence to medicine isn't so great. Staying on diet isn't so great. They're kind of in and out of the system. And one of the things we have to do is both make sure that we're treating all of their issues and kind of getting a holistic health plan together for them. And then in addition, make sure that we're being paid the right amount to take care of them, because we are responsible for all their care. So for us, growth is a great thing, but it's expensive. And so fundamentally, these businesses are going to be based on scale. And fundamentally, there's a bet that these businesses will pay off over time. When you run the math and you look at businesses with millions of patients who are 3 and 4 years with these kinds of organizations, the cash flows look really, really good. But it will take investment. And so in our case, at least for us, it's a matter of getting to the scale. And we are still very, very much in an investment mode at Iora. And our our friends at Oak are too. And then there's a second nuance that I don't understand as well, and I won't pretend to, that not all of these risk-based organizations have the same customer sets, and there's some differences in geography and exactly which customers they have and what programs they're on. So, I'm not as well versed in that relative to some of the others in the area, but certainly some of the businesses where you're targeting specific geographies and specific types of patients can get profitable a little bit more quickly because it's a more common model across them. On the broad base, you just have to get to scale. That scale is the only way you'll get cash flows over time. And that is the big entrepreneurial bet in this space. And so far, investors are really willing to bet behind that, but that's the risk and the potential reward in the space as well.
Great. Aaron, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think I would say that that value-based care is kind of a buzzword, but it really does mean something. It means that we finally started the process leading with Medicare because it's the biggest payer, but we've seen a fast follow by commercial insurance arrangements. It is a lifeboat from a prevailing fee-for-service paradigm that kills innovation. If you are a business that lives on the 15-minute treadmill of taking care of patients in short clips because you've got to satisfy the billing gods and submit enough claims to get enough revenue that exceeds your costs, you're not thinking about innovation. You're not thinking about what Jillian and team are doing. You're not thinking about redesigning how do we want the system to be for our own parents and our own families. That's impossible if you're in a fee-for-service dominated system. And amazingly, and I'm knocking on wood every day, the changes that we've seen in value-based care that do, of course, come from a long lineage dating for decades back to new care, payment and care models, even in the 70s and even before. But the most recent, chapter in the value-based, journey really started with the Affordable Care Act and perhaps the High Tech Act, if I can be, having been involved in the High Tech Act, if I can say that, because it produces a more level information ecosystem. To have electronic health records more broadly used is crucial. We need information to flow. But then the Affordable Care Act has a number of new, not just pilots, but new payment paradigms that have spawned, multi-billions of dollars of new companies like Aledade, like Iora, like many others that are trying to use the freedom afforded by value-based payment arrangements to rethink how to organize medical care. And so my knocking on the wood moment is that has survived. There is some really good evidence now from the Affordable Care Act that particular models, and I'll say physician-led ACOs, are consistently the biggest winner of all the tests that CMS has done, partly because it's really complicated to put hospitals in an ACO construct when lowering the cost of care means cannibalizing their core revenue and their core business model. But there are many hospitals trying hard and doing well in various ways to use the gift of value-based care to rethink how we want to move money around, how we want to invest in things that there's no billing code for, but to do so knowing that there's a potential way of capitalizing those things through value-based arrangements. So I would say critical to all this is really good information. And we don't have great information now, as we've all been saying, but we have a lot more information than we did when everything was written down and neatly organized in manila folders. And we don't have, our value-based arrangements today are not monolithic. They're not in every market. They vary by payer. They vary in a lot of ways that are kind of idiosyncratic, but there's enough movement to really see the promise of innovation of companies and investors willing to try in this new ecosystem to test theories about what care could look like. And I think, there's a whole, even in just the last 2 weeks, a number of IPO announcements of such companies that would not exist without without some alternative to pure fee for service. Certainly Alidade would not exist. If we were trying to provide clinical support and data support and technology at no cost to practices, with a business model that says we will only get paid if you get paid more. That is, we will only get paid if we help you become successful in value-based care, and thereby you, the practice, earn more money. That business model doesn't work if we're just in fee-for-service. Practices don't have enough money to buy anything by design. So I think my comment is all of this stuff that we're talking about, all these innovations and uses of data really are, at least I wouldn't say predicated on value-based arrangements, but they're certainly rocket fuel to the kind of innovation we want to test and see in healthcare. And there will be a lot of companies that will continue to try, and some will fail. But I think overall, there's an ecosystem of I'd say competitor. I mean, we would look at the IOR and say, we want IOR to win big, right? Because it's a big ocean. There's a lot of new things to learn. There's a lot of needs. There's a lot of primary care deserts around the country that don't have enough of anything. So I'm excited about that. And I think we have a lot to learn thanks to advancements in data, thanks to advancements in payment, and thanks to the grit and ingenuity of people and clinicians trying to make it better. So I'll leave you for that.
Thank you.
A note of hope there.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, not quite the end yet. So Gwendolyn has asked a question a very specific question that I don't know the answer to. Let me ask whether anyone knows the answer to the question of whether the Biden's infrastructure plan addresses the need for better health care. For better healthcare analytics, and I think that might be a good opening for the question that is very challenging for some entrepreneurs to deal with the relationship between policy and evolving policy and opportunities for entrepreneurial ventures, which is probably more dominant as a set of considerations in healthcare than in any other space, because there's so much policy that is sort of on the horizon, seems to make sense, but whether it'll happen and whether it'll create these opportunities remains a big question. So let me ask first whether anyone knows that whether the infrastructure bill addresses healthcare analytics, and if not, let's just speculate on the broader question of the relationship between policy and entrepreneurship in this space. Faye, do you?
So yes, so Jean, I think someone actually wrote. Oh, was that you, Aaron? Yeah, it was. Yes, with regard to broadband, and
yeah,
with regard to with regard to broadband, which becomes
right.
even more important. So yeah, that's all I was going to add to that. You were going to ask a question.
Well, since you have the floor, and as you advise entrepreneurial ventures, how do you get them to think about evolving policy, some of the issues that Aaron has put out there as we move to fee for service? How do we get paid? We have healthcare delivery systems that are so dominated by the fee for service model, and really, for good reasons, they have to survive.
Yeah.
So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, in terms of policy, I think one of the things that comes to mind when it comes to entrepreneurial ventures is that, yes, if you're creating a model, whatever technology or innovation that you're putting out there, the results that you are getting or the impact of your work, how can you better inform health policy for sure? And beyond the health policy, we need to think about the point that data is just the starting point. And so where can there be what I consider policy when it comes to humans being in the loop? So the human into the loop sort of perspective is something that I would offer that entrepreneurial ventures will think about in terms of informing policy. While the applications may be generating recommendations or decisions, there's still a need for human ingenuity and weigh in, and hopefully the policies that will be created from that will certainly support that human intervention.
Yeah, that's great. It harkens back to Jillian's point about the humanity and the care as a core part of their business model. Yeah, thanks very much. Anyone else want to offer thoughts on evolution of policy and how entrepreneurs should think about that as they create innovations and try to go to market with companies that improve healthcare?
Sure. I mean, I'll jump in quickly. I mean, the first statement I think is the most obvious, which is, in healthcare, you can't ignore the policy element. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs and folks with traditional business mindsets, especially when they're new to healthcare, do that, right? And so just appreciating the government is inherently linked, given its critical role as a payer, but also as often kind of the policymaker that then flows through. I think with that being said, the similarity to other settings is, an entrepreneur needs to look at how they're going to get paid, right? And that's, true in fill in the blank, any space. And so there are plenty of ways to get paid in fee for service. You just have to line up into that, right? And where is the margin coming from? If it's, kind of you're looking at vaccines, well, you realize this is the reimbursement they're getting, or this is the loss that comes from not having inventory. And so now we have, even though it's not a value-based payment, now we're providing real value to the primary care clinic, and therefore kind of there's a money stream to come back our way. And so I think that is sometimes the challenge in healthcare is folks get so excited about the solution, a little bit back to Aaron's, we've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And they neglect to think about, well, follow the money. And so those, purpose and dollars need to come together for healthcare entrepreneurship to work successfully.
Great thoughts. Thank you very much. Well, we have 4 minutes left. I think this has been a wonderful discussion. I thank you all. And let me just ask each of you if you have a final thought for the audience. I really appreciate this conversation so far. Jillian, let me start with you, and then
just grasping for a final thought. Now, look, I think we're very much early days in some of these new business models of healthcare, and I think key in my mind is balancing the new business model of healthcare with the better outcomes and better results, which is what it really is all about. And so, that balance is one of the trickiest moral balances, I think, of the business we are in. And I'm really hoping that all these great minds can collectively get to really great answers on it.
Great. Jillian, thank you very much. Faye, how about you? Any
Yeah, just as a parting word, I'm going to go back to Aaron's ask the right question. I like that idea. Ask the right question, and in answering those questions, center equity in asking the right questions. Where's the equity? Because one of the things that was mentioned here is that oftentimes the innovation is biased in the fact that it's the innovation. And there are other biases that creep in as well. And so centering equity at the foci of the innovation and asking the right question are key.
That is terrific. Aaron, it seems like that's a great segue to your final thought. Thank you, Faye.
Yes, this has been a great learning opportunity. I guess I would just end by reminding us that Yahoo search used to be the way we searched for information, and no longer, most of us have forgotten that it exists. And that just means things evolve, and innovation means companies and ideas need to constantly iterate and needs to constantly assess what value they're creating. And we are all people who are comfortable with that kind of change mindset. That just because we learn something today doesn't mean that 5 years from now it will be as popular as it is now. So this is a tough environment to be in, but an exciting one. I'm really hopeful about the key contributions of data, payment change, innovation, delivery models that really can hopefully do something important and meaningful in our healthcare system.
Aaron, thank you. And Brad, to you for a final thought, please.
Sure. I think I'd go back to thinking about partnerships. that I think creative destruction looks different in healthcare because we're talking in delivery in particular, is we're talking about people's health. And so kind of simply removing a player and making them disappear when they're so critical in that infrastructure, it may happen eventually, but it rarely happens instantaneously. And so kind of how can we bring together the new ventures, the existing players centered around the patients, often those who've been left behind, in order to improve the overall system?
Brad, thank you. Well, let me just thank all of our panelists. Really, really thoughtful, stimulating, wonderful discussion. Thank you all. And thanks to all of you that attended. I hope you found this worthwhile. Thanks to the Keenan Institute, the rest of UNC. Such a pleasure to be with all of you. Thank you again. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, John, so much. And thank you, panelists. That was wonderful. I think y'all really highlighted, a lot of the things that are specific to healthcare, both the opportunities and the challenges related to scale, related to equity, related to how to leverage these new evolutions. So thank you so much for bringing all of your expertise and engaging in a really great conversation for our audience. John, thank you for moderating, and Maka, thank you so much for setting up the panel with all of your research that you put into the trends report. So audience, thanks for being here. Thanks for hanging in. So we are 3/4 of the way through the conference. So we are going to now go to a break until 12:40. So you can just, come back to this room. We're going to put, a hold screen, and we'll come back on here at 12:40, or you can close it down and then re-access it through the agenda. Until then, you can also connect with us on Twitter, hashtag KIVE 2021. So everyone go grab a quick lunch, grab a quick walk, and we look forward to seeing you back at 12:40. Bye.
Hello, everybody. My name is Chris Bingham. I'm a professor of strategy and entrepreneurship at UNC Kenan-Flagler and faculty director of the Entrepreneurship Center. I'd like to welcome you to this, the fourth and concluding session of the Frontiers of Entrepreneurship Conference. This session focuses on human capital, specifically teams and talent. Now, let me set the stage for this session. In 1936, an obscure rowing team from the University of Washington traveled to Germany to participate in the Olympic Games. It was the depths of the Great Depression. These were working class boys whose small mining and lumber towns donated bits of money so they could travel to Berlin. Every aspect of the competition seemed stacked against them. But something happened in the race. In the rowing world, they call it swing. Listen to this description based on the book, The Boys in the Boat. There is a thing that happens sometimes that is hard to achieve and hard to define. It's called swing. It happens only when all are rowing in such perfect unison that not a single action is out of sync. Rowers must rein in their fierce independence and at the same time hold true to their individual capabilities. Races are not won by clones. Good crews are good blends. Someone to lead the charge, someone to hold something in reserve, someone to fight the fight, someone to make peace. No rower is more valuable than another. All are assets to the boat. But if they are to row well together, each must adjust to the needs and capabilities of the others. The shorter arm person reaching a little farther, the longer arm person pulling in just a bit. Differences can be turned to advantage instead of disadvantage. Only then will it feel as if the boat is moving on its own. Only then does pain entirely give way to exultation. Good swing feels like good poetry. Against towering obstacles, this team found perfect swing and won. The Olympic gold was exhilarating, but the unity each rower experienced that day was a moment that stayed with them all their lives. Making your organizational boat swing requires effective use of your teams and talent. Making your boat swing is hard enough. Making it swing in entrepreneurial settings is perhaps even more challenging. And that's because leaders in entrepreneurial settings are routinely contending with the destabilizing forces of technological innovation, competition, and industry disruption. Moreover, with certain sectors rapidly expanding in a remote work environment and a renewed focus on diversity, many leaders have been forced to manage distributed teams and hire people they have never met in person. How will they do all this successfully? What will be the effects of the current environment on team and co-founder dynamics or talent acquisition? More broadly, what is the evolving role of human capital in growth, innovation, and effective opportunity capture? This is what our trends report section on teams and talent helps address. This is what our panel will address with us now. Before I introduce our next speaker, I'd like to remind you that if you have any questions during today's panel, please submit them using the Q&A button on your screen, and we'll get to as many of them as we can at the end of the session. With that, I'd like to hand things off to the fabulous David Hsu, Richard Sapp Professor of Management at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania, to present a few trends on entrepreneurial teams and talent. David?
Thanks, Chris. I should just mention every time I hear you, Chris, I learn something new. So thank you for the background here. I've been tasked to take 10 minutes to introduce the 2021 Trends Report on human capital, talent, and teams. And with that release, I think you'll be very pleased to find a lot of interesting information and trends, topics that range from opportunity versus necessity entrepreneurs, what are the success factors, particularly in the 2021 environment, that are related to those success factors. You'll also find quite a bit of material in the report related to a very notable trend that we have all viscerally experienced in the last year, which is the remote work. And what I'd actually like to do with the 10 minutes that I have is to actually share a story and how it relates to the remote work. So January 29th, 2020, I'm going to start sharing my screen. This is what I was doing. Hopefully you should be able to see my screen here. I was in Florida at the Breakers attending this conference. And just to give you a visual of what we were all looking at that time, for those who were there, you'll recall, beautiful scenes, right? And in one of the sessions in the conference, I happened to be seated next to the CEO of AngelList, Kevin Laws. And I have no idea whether, Kevin, you're on the call, but as you'll recall, Kevin, we had this discussion that opportunities like this conference really enable, which is academics meeting people from practitioners, all united to really push the frontiers of entrepreneurship. And as a result of that serendipitous meeting, I was able to access the AngelList data. Unbeknownst to us, the world was about to shut down. And thankfully, we got the data access, and it actually led to a very interesting project that I want to just take a few minutes to tell you about because it relates to one of these key trends, which is on the role of remote work. And we're going to actually take a look at regional advantage. And so just to tee this up a little bit, we all know that companies have already announced that they're going fully or in part after the pandemic breaks to remote work, really just kind of continuing what we've been doing. These are all the icons or kind of list of companies, just a small sample of companies that fall in that domain. Other companies have just decided, hey, we're just going to move out of Silicon Valley. And so that's obviously companies like Oracle, Palantir, really grabbing those headlines. On the other side of the ledger, some companies like Netflix, when are you going to bring your workforce back? Well, 12 hours after the vaccine is approved. So very different sentiment in terms of what should be the future organization of work post-pandemic. And of course, lots of headlines like this, which is on the worker side. Well, I'm not getting all the benefits of living in Silicon Valley, and I'm incurring all the costs during the pandemic, so I'm moving out. And so that kind of tees up this question that we're able to grapple with in this work, which is twofold. Do startups attract more better talent when they permit remote work? And is there short-run evidence of an exodus of talent from Silicon Valley post-COVID shutdown? And I'm not going to give you all the blow-by-blow detail, but what we find in this AngelList data is the answer to both questions is really yes. And just to take a step back, I'm not going to go into the details of this, but it is very, very difficult to study these high-tech labor markets because usually we have data from one side of the market or the other. Moreover, it's even more difficult to study the role of remote work because firms are not, offering titles or skills randomly that would be conducive to remote work. And so what was nice about this empirical setting is that COVID-19, if you want to hire, it's got to be remote. And we're going to be able to exploit that a little bit in order to shed some insight on those two research questions. by taking use of this data. I'm not going to go through all of this information, but this is one of the leading platforms, not only to do angel rounds, but also increasingly to recruit on this job market. And so enabled by Kevin, we were able to access a rich set of data, not only on job postings, but also on applicants in the months that span the shutdown centered on March 13th of last year. And just to give you a flavor of the type of firms and skills and jobs, I've just listed here the most frequent firms. You'll see some household names. You'll see that many of the skills are very tech or management oriented. You see the top job titles there. That gives you a feel for this type of platform and the participants on that platform. And just to illustrate how skills and job titles really differ by remote versus not. What I'm listing here on the left-hand side are the skills that are most likely to be remote and the job titles that are most likely to be remote. And on the right-hand side, those that are most likely not to be remote. And so this is all looking at within the very specialized high tech, but you can imagine that this plays out even more in spades on one trend that's highlighted in the trends report, which is the necessity entrepreneurship as well. I'm not going to go through this, but essentially we can do a empirical strategy that makes use of this forced shutdown to really kind of allow us to take off the table firm selection into jobs that are remote through this apparatus. Let me just give you a quick preview of the results, and I can tell it all in graphs. So of the applicants from Silicon Valley, there is an unmistakable trend that people in Silicon Valley are by and large applying for jobs outside of Silicon Valley post-shutdown. Now, the beneficiaries of that, not surprisingly, are the second tier tech hubs. They experience quite a lift in the both the quantity as well as the quality of the job applicants that they're receiving. But two important caveats. One, if you offer remote work and you're in Silicon Valley, that can actually stem the tide a little bit, both in the quantity and the quality of the talent exodus. Though in general, applicants that are rated as higher quality are much more likely to apply outside of Silicon Valley post-closure. And so it's indicative of possibly some short-run trends that could be going on. We're not able to say anything, of course, in what's going to happen over the long run, nor are we really able to say, remember, these are the labor market patterns. We can't yet say Silicon Valley is dead in terms of entrepreneurial activity because the founder behavior and the labor market behavior may be distinct. And then finally, ideally, we've only told you about preferences of employees and applicants. Ideally, we would say something about their productivity and creativity, not only by remote work, but also by geography. Presumably, they'd be moving to be because of lifestyle, because of family, other things. We're not able to say anything yet in terms of both the shift in the labor market as well as the productivity and creativity. That was just a taste of the research that we've done in this realm. I really encourage everyone to take a look at the trends report because there's some rich detail on aspects that touch on teams, talent, trends that are salient, that relate to diversity, equity, inclusion, as well as trends that relate to remote work and the organization of work going forward. So let me turn it back over to Chris, who's going to introduce the panel.
Thanks a lot, David, for your thoughts, particularly your fresh insights about remote work. David always pushes the envelope on new and exciting work. So thanks for giving us a sneak peek into the work you're doing. I'd now like to welcome my colleague, Sekou Bermis, Associate Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship at UNC Kenan-Flagler, to moderate our fabulous panel discussion on human capital. Sekou?
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it. And you took my Olympic rowing story. That was going to be how I opened up my session. And now, alas, I don't have an anecdote. So I'll just have to dive straight in to talk about the topic. Well, I'm very happy to be here with you. As Chris noted, I am an associate professor of strategy and entrepreneurship at Keenan Flagler. And the session that we're going to talk about today is, I think, a topic that interweaves very nicely with many of the topics that we've been discussing over the past 2 days, which is human capital, people. You know, I think it goes without saying, though it should be said, that the engine of entrepreneurship is driven by getting people to cooperate, to come together, and figuring out how to optimize that, how to help innovators and to help organizations that are trying to bring people together is critically important to helping get that engine to rev at its highest RPMs. And so that's the kind of setting for this. And so with that, I want to bring in my esteemed panel of speakers who come from very different facets of this topic. And so I will kind of give them very high level name and title. I have scheduled or set up this session so that they will each have kind of some opening remarks to talk about topics that are near and dear to their hearts, or their ideas, problems that they'd like to discuss. So each of them will have some time there, and they can talk a little bit more about themselves then, though they only have 3 minutes, so don't go on too long. And then we will open it up for some questions that we have prepared, but also we will be taking questions from you all. So please use the Q&A box. If you have questions, I will be keeping my eye on that and bringing them up to our panelists. So we have 3 panelists. I'll introduce each alphabetically, just to keep this all fair and square here. So first up is Diane Burton. She is the professor and department chair for the Department of Human Resource Studies at the ILR School at Cornell University. Our second panelist is Kathleen Boyle-Dalen, who is the Chief Talent Officer for Kauffman. And last but not least, only alphabetically, of course, is Brad Feld, who is a managing director for Foundry Group and the co-founder for Techstars. So, like I said, very esteemed panel. I have my pen ready to take notes on these opening remarks. And so we will go in that order. So Diane, would you like to kick us off?
Terrific. Thanks so much. Really happy to be here. Although I have to say, David's remarks just triggered for me the benefit of in-person gatherings and the serendipity that you get, and really, what we can't really replicate in a virtual world. And we have to keep that front and center, even though everyone is touting the benefits of doing, remote work and virtual work. There are also some real downsides and losses. So as was described, I'm the academic on this panel. I chair a human resource studies department, which is kind of an unusual department, and I sit in a labor school, which is again a kind of rarity in the world. And I think both of those things are going to explain my perspective, which is really about the workers, right? So much of what we know about entrepreneurship is based on studies of founders. And our topic here is founding teams. Well, but what do we mean by the team? Many entrepreneurial ventures are solo ventures. And the second most common pattern, at least when we look broadly in the world, is spousal pairs or family units coming together to found firms. And so our focus on teams, of course, we know comes from the high-tech world, but I think we want to think more broadly, okay, what do we mean by team? Also recognizing that the team evolves over time. So the founding team changes, you add more people, we see professionalization or swapping people out, and we kind of know that happens. I think we want to be a little more precise. The second thing I want to just highlight is this idea of a job, right? We often talk about entrepreneurship. Why do we care about entrepreneurship? Well, it's a source of job creation. Well, if we think about jobs as a bundle of tasks in exchange for wages, okay, then it's a job creator. But I think what we care about is actually good jobs, the kind of jobs you would hope your children have and your friends have and your family members have. And what does that look like? That's much more than an exchange of labor for for money. It involves things like having benefits, which we know that entrepreneurial firms are much less likely to provide. It involves some sort of stability, predictability. It involves some sort of opportunities for career advancement. And again, I think this is a conversation we need to be having, because there's some evidence that the entrepreneurial firms that provide such things do better in the long run. Okay, that's my opening. A plea for thinking about job quality.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much. And you kept it under time. I didn't even have to get the hook out. So thank you for that. All right. So next up, Kathleen Boyle-Dalen.
Thanks. Diane, I got to start by saying I couldn't agree more. I'm with you on there are benefits to remote work, but boy, there are benefits to in-person interaction too. So I'm Kathleen Boyle-Dalen, and I'm a psychologist by training, sitting inside the Kauffman Foundation, where we work to advance inclusive prosperity through education and entrepreneurship. And I'm so excited about this session, because to me, this stuff, the people stuff, is at the very core of why some businesses work and others don't. And one place that I'm spending a lot of my time right now is on our work inside the foundation to advance a culture of racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so I just wanted to open up by not giving you a why for that work that's based in data. You already have all of that data, but instead I'm going to make it personal. And so, for me, I get to come to work each day excited. I come to work filled with energy, feeling supported, heard, and valued. And those feelings of being supported, heard, and valued, they enable me to text my boss, our CEO, with crazy ideas, with worries, with things that aren't going well, all of it. They enable me to call her or another member of our team when I am trying to figure something out and work my way through a problem that has me feeling anxious or angry or unhinged. And I can do that in a pretty uncensored way. And those conversations, they are magic. I think they are the magic of teams, because those conversations lead to me being able to be a better me for those around me. They lead to ideas, they lead to solutions and opportunities. So I would just urge everyone, think about that in your own life right now. Do you have that person, that team in your work life? That person or that team who you know for sure has your back, who wants to hear your ideas, and who you know will help you when things go wildly off the rails, as we know they do. Well, here's the thing. What I am learning from my work with my Black and BIPOC colleagues is that far too often for them, the answer to that question is no. And so here are three questions that I'm grappling with. So 3 things that our team is grappling with as we work to make racial equity, diversity, and inclusion real in our culture. First one is, how do we create conditions where leaders and teams build muscles of self-awareness and curiosity? Because we know for this work, this racial equity and inclusion work to really stick, we're going to need those muscles. And I'll pause here for a second. And if you're sitting there thinking to yourself, I can already check that box, I know for sure I'm self-aware. I like to sometimes think about myself. Well, we know the research is pretty clear on this. We know that 90% of us believe we are self-aware, and about 10% of us actually are. The second big question I'm asking myself is, how do we double down on our capacity to listen? So at the foundation, we have a presentation coach. We get really good at talking about our own ideas. And so why do we not have a listening coach? Because when I look at my own work at the foundation to advance racial equity and inclusion, the places where I've made the greatest missteps, I can draw a direct line from those missteps to my lack of real listening. And then finally, what I'm wondering about is, can we begin to take some of what's known about growth mindset and apply that in really practical ways to help teams and leaders foster equity and inclusion? The foundation is doing some work around growth mindset, specifically with entrepreneurs. And I think that there is a link between building a culture of growth mindset and creating conditions that foster racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. So that's it. That's a little bit about what we're working on.
Excellent. Thank you, Kathleen. That's great. And I forgot to do this after Diane mentioned, but these topics link into what you will find in the trends report. So a bit about what Diane was talking about as far as the nature of those teams that are founding new ventures. One of the trends we see are a lot more of these solo ventures that are becoming unicorns, so to speak. But we all know you don't become a unicorn by yourself. So you might be solo founded, but you bring on a team, right? And so what is the founder versus employee, and how does that operate? What's an ideal way to approach that? And then with what Kathleen is talking about in the form of diversity, equity, and inclusion, aside from just ventures themselves kind of dealing with this, a lot of the trends report goes into how this is finding its way into conversations that LPs are having with GPs, for example, and the like, about asking and pushing for more information about how diversity and equity and inclusion are being incorporated in decisions around investing and the like. So definitely aligned there. All right. So last but certainly not least, Brad.
Good to see everyone. Thanks for having me. Brad Feld, I'm a partner at a venture firm called Foundry Group. We have about $3 billion under management. We invest directly in companies, but 25% of our capital is invested in early stage venture funds. We've got about 40 partner funds that we've invested in. Also co-founded Techstars in 2006, which today runs about 40 accelerator programs globally and makes about 400 investments around the world. I want to talk about three things that have been prompted by the beginning conversation here. One, Diana made, I think, some powerful and useful comments, but categorized the universe as underneath it as entrepreneurship. And I think one of the challenges is the word entrepreneurship today is a word that is now being used to encapsulate a very, very broad set of types of companies. And as a result, the nuance in the dynamics vary dramatically depending on the type of business. A phrase that the Kauffman Foundation pioneered in the 1990s is high growth entrepreneurship. And it's a phrase that I don't think has been broadly persistent, but there's a very interesting phenomena that globally that is happening, but that we can reference in the US. The primary government agency in the US with regard to entrepreneurship is the Small Business Administration. And politically, the phrases small business, Main Street business, and entrepreneurship are all linked together in sort of one institution. One of the phenomena I've experienced with my own work with both Techstars and books I've written like Startup Communities is this broad democratization of entrepreneurship globally over the last decade. And that broad globalization or democratization of entrepreneurship in a lot of ways starts to create more clarity on even segmentation of types of businesses. And it's not a judgment on which are good or which are bad. It's that the characteristics and dynamics among them are quite different. And a very simple heuristic that I started using in 2012 when I wrote Startup Communities was high growth entrepreneurs versus local business. And the difference between sort of the aspiration of the business, even if they were 1 or 2 or 3 employees, based on the characteristic of the business. And I think in the context of remote work, the dynamics are quite different, both in terms of labor, but also customer, both in terms of the way those businesses function and the relationship those businesses have to other businesses that they are geographically proximate to. Second comment I'd like to make is came from David's sort of ending conclusion, and he had a line that said short-term versus long-term. And it sort of followed the statement of, it's too early to say that Silicon Valley is dead. I have a book on my coffee table. I live in Boulder, Colorado, by the way. I've never lived in the Bay Area. I've spent an enormous amount of time there. It's not my place. They're not my people. It's not the kind of scene that I want to be part of. But I've made many investments there over the years, have lots of friends there, lots of business colleagues there, but it's just not home for me. So I've been able to participate, but not by being a resident of and inside it. The book on my coffee tables is called 100 Years of Silicon Valley, and it was written in 1994. So one of my deep premises is that these arcs are extremely long-term arcs. And one of the challenges with the contemporary discussion about remote work is it's an extraordinarily short-term phenomena and discussion. And it's a discussion that's being driven by 12 months of dislocation as a society that's unprecedented in any of our lives. And the dynamics of it have many, many, many second and third order effects, which maybe we'll go into, maybe we won't, but have a lot to do also with the dynamics of remote work. So I just sort of put that out there, as I think that the short-term impacts, of which many, many studies will come out about, and the short-term predictions, actually, I think have little to no long-term coherence, because there's so many things that are happening right now that are impossible for us to understand what they're going to play into. And so there's a lot of value in the short-term analysis, but it needs to be done, at least from my frame of reference, with a long-term view. Last comment I'd make is bias. There's a phenomenal film called Bias by a woman named Robin Hauser. My wife, Amy Batchelor, and I were two of the executive producers on it. It's now available on Amazon for people that want to sort of dig into, just sort of roll around in the notion of bias. And we all have bias. There's lots of phrases around bias. Bias has certainly surfaced more visibly in a business context, both around equity, and I use the word equity specifically versus the word equality, not just on racial dimension, but also on gender, age, a number of other characteristics around equity, sexual orientation, sexual preference. There is a significant bias with regard to people's view on work. And if you go a level down, their bias as to whether they want to be in person or not. And it's quite difficult to separate that bias from the actual things that are happening. And that's true generally speaking. And I'll use the Netflix slide as an example. I have about 80 data points from CEOs that we're direct investors in. The 50% of those CEOs who, like Reed Hastings, embrace physical intimacy with other people. And I don't mean that in a sexual way. I mean that in terms of a need to be around other people as a cultural norm or a cultural belief. All have that similar kind of bias. We are going to get back into the office no matter what, completely independent of what the employee base feels or the individual employees feel and what their own challenges and constraints are. If you're an employee who is immune compromised, back to work 12 hours after the vaccines are approved is not a very smart thing to do as a business, nor is it a very comfortable thing to do as an individual. In addition, the notion of introvert versus extrovert, people who are individual contributor versus team contributor, people who are leaders versus people who are managers, people who are doing deep, thoughtful, isolated work versus people who need to work collaboratively, people who need extended period of time alone versus people who go from meeting to meeting to meeting. Again, there's not just in their role, but in their own personality, some of which bias towards the roles they end up having, but don't always. And that bias is something that I think merits a lot of investigation in the context of remote work, because I think there's a lot of leaders who are making assertions about remote, hybrid, in-person based on their own biases versus what the actual dynamics are and how that works best for all the people working in those companies.
All right. Wow. Okay. I've been taking, like I said, I've already been taking furious notes. So this is really good. So I want to start our panel off with a generalized question that I think is fairly related to some of Brad's comments around the shift to virtual work due to COVID, and now the discussions and the beginnings of this returning to work. And so this is something that I am asked all the time by students, by other companies, come and kind of talk to them, like, what is the future of work going to look like? And I'm a little partial to say, like, well, it's probably gonna look a lot like how it looked before if you look in the long term, but I know what they're asking, which is something is gonna change, and what is it? And so I wanna kind of ask to you in kind of what you've seen in your work or readings, et cetera. How do you see this talent management strategies being impacted by this pandemic? And you can also incorporate now, I think, the return to work movement or discussions. And you can take them in any order that you like.
So I can jump in a little bit on this. So we interact with the kind of senior most HR professionals in large global companies on a regular basis, and every single one of them is struggling with this. And and in many ways, one of the things they're struggling against is what Brad talked about, right? With Reed Hastings. When you have a leader who has a particular perspective and wants to put a blanket policy in, that is both disrespectful of the employee population, but it's also ignoring the variety of the jobs and roles and tasks. And so really sensible leaders are being thoughtful about what is it that we're trying to do? What do different people do? And doing quite nuanced analyses of roles and activities and the temporal dimensions of these things, recognizing lots can be done hybrid. There's actually not that much that absolutely always 100% of the time has to be done in person, and the range of where you need to be. We're really talking about kind of decoupling physical location from tasks, and when that is and is not possible, well, that's on a you can analyze that on a role by role case, but it takes a lot of work to do that. Again, it's the sophisticated analysis of the work that you're doing and the people who are occupying the roles, and the possibility of reshuffling those. Just because a bundle of tasks has existed one way, can it be allocated differently?
I'll tag in there and just add that I guess my hope is that on future of work, we're not just talking about where you're sitting when you're working. And so, yes, 100% I agree. Like the where you're sitting when you're working matters. It matters to leaders, to teams. So I'm not suggesting that can get ignored. And I think what's been made more vivid for all of us are mental health, wellness, need for boundaries. What does it even look like to have boundaries around kind of work and life? And what does that mean? Equity. And so I think I'm hoping that when we kind of when we're each designing with teams our approach to future of work, that we're both paying attention to where people are sitting when they're working, and we're taking an expansive view that takes into account the issues that were simply kind of made more vivid for most of us over this past year.
I'd add that there's an extraordinary, not a small, but an extraordinary number of activities in business, and especially in entrepreneurship, that have enormous wasted time, energy, and money and friction because of the historical need of geographic movement to execute those things. And the two kind of extremely obvious ones in hindsight are raising money and selling things. Let me just use raising money as an example. I've taken a number of companies public, and I've been the principal on taking a number of companies public. I took a company public on January 4th. So Monday, right after New Year's. I started at 9:30 in the morning. We priced the deal at 3:30 in the afternoon, and it started trading the next day. And I did it from this seat. Historically, that would be a 3-week process on private planes, spewing lots of, carbon into the air, going from 30-minute meeting to Blacktown car to next 30-minute meeting to Blacktown car to next 30-minute meeting to airport to private plane to next city, collapsing at night, trying to get through my email from whatever happened that day, and then doing it the next day for 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, depending on the size of the deal. COVID and the COVID crisis obliterated that motion. And I don't think that's going back. I don't think the people being pitched to enjoyed that motion. I don't think the investment bankers enjoyed that motion. I don't think the entrepreneurs enjoyed that motion. And it's a waste of time, money, and energy. There are multiple examples like that. So that's one layer. The other layer is, I remember in March, a year ago, when people started to deal with lockdown in Colorado. We were quite early with it because about 100 business leaders called out publicly to Jared Polis, who's our governor, to do a mandatory lockdown. And we basically said, for all businesses that can lock down, can go home and have people work from home, do it immediately. And we did this about a week before in the US that started to happen. And for those 100 companies, we all went remote the next day. Like, that was the thing. We just said, we don't know what's going to happen here. Let's just take the next couple of weeks and be remote and just let people be safe, and we'll figure it out. And of course, that turned into a year plus. I remember about 2 weeks into that hearing regularly, and there was a big market freak out in the public markets, and everybody said the private markets are going to close because people can't do financings, because people will never do a deal if they can't get together with each other, and you won't be able to sell anything because nobody will ever buy anything if you can't get together with anybody. And yeah, there were definitely challenges in the first couple of months of that. But 14 months later, 13 months later, done. There was also this view that the technology wouldn't support it. I don't know if people remember sort of the please watch Netflix on low definition. Please don't, your kids have to do school. So, don't try to do Zoom between this time and that time. Gone. And yeah, there's massive inequity in terms of broadband access in the US and computer access in the US. That's a different issue. And that's an issue that, unfortunately, for the last year has not been addressed particularly well at a national basis in the US. But some cities and some states have done quite a good job on it, especially with public-private partnerships. And my hope is that there's a view going forward of, on the dimension of equity, really giving people access to high-speed broadband and to computing so that they have that flexibility, so that we don't create even more of that challenge. It's easy to say, hey, Brad, that's great, but you're talking about rich people raising money versus people who have to have their kids educated that don't have resources, or single parents with kids. And the point of all of that, though, is that it's not a technology constraint. It's not a behavioral constraint. And instead of viewing it historically as a constraint, we should view it as an opportunity, I think, to generate much more equity and much more flexibility going forward, while eliminating very obvious and clear points of friction of both time, money, and energy of humans along that path.
Yeah, and so that's really great, insightful, thinking about things that have changed and people have realized, man, I never want to go back, versus things that have changed and people are still longing for it to go back, right? And so what I get from the comments from all three of you are, if I may, there needs to be a bit of an audit, right, around tasks and actions that we've been doing in this ecosystem. We've had some forced changes due to the pandemic, and then assessing, have these forced changes been good or bad, about the same, et cetera? And as we reconfigure or think about designing these systems in the future, kind of take those learnings, right? And so I think there's a huge opportunity to figure out how to go about assessing and auditing, things like the bundle of resources or the tasks that we were doing and who should be doing certain tasks and the like, right? It's absolutely there. All right, so I want to actually build on something. I'm going to go out of order from the list that I sent to the panelists, but I want to talk about policies, because I think that links a lot to what Brad was talking about as far as the frictions in the system and the like. So what are some policies that you all have either seen in this space that you think have been useful, or maybe what are needed, right? What are some policies maybe that are needed? And these can be, you know, organizational policies, or they can be kind of more generally kind of governance policies at the state level, federal level, et cetera.
So I have a colleague who's been doing some comparative work, Michelle Ballot. She's been doing comparative work looking cross-nationally at the impacts of COVID across different nations. She compares the US, the UK, China, Italy, and I'm blanking on her last. So there are some universal patterns about who's hit the hardest, right? We know it's lower income workers. We know it's women. We know it's younger people. We know it's certain industries. But the resilience of businesses and of people varied dramatically across these nations, depending on, you know, what I would describe as the industrial relations systems, but it's really the broader set of policies, the quality of the social safety net, the quality of the healthcare system. And again, we are able to look cross-nationally, but I think we also see that varying across states and even across regions. You know, Brad, I'm jealous, you know, here I am in central New York. Many of my colleagues live in places where you don't get cell phone reception, let alone fast broadband. And we were sending school buses around with Wi-Fi hotspots and the free school lunches so that the students could bring their school provided, you know, laptops or tablets out and download their materials for the day, pick up their lunch, and then go back into their, you know, modest homes to do their work. And so these disparities, I think I am reminded anytime I drive across town of how vast they really are and how invisible they are to so many people.
Let me add on to that. I totally, I not just understand it, but I'm empathetic's the wrong word. I'm deeply offended by our policy response to this historically. I live in Colorado. Colorado has 5 primary metros, Denver, Boulder, Fort Collins, Colorado Springs, and Grand Junction. 70% of the population of the state is in those 5 cities. I've spent a ton of time in non-urban Colorado, or which, you know, some people call rural Colorado, in the past 5 years, especially around entrepreneurship. And it is remarkable, if anybody who's ever come out to Colorado, it is remarkable how there are patches of connectivity. And I don't mean that there are places where there isn't connectivity, but there are patches of connectivity. And I'm very close to our Attorney General, a guy named Phil Weiser, who ran a thing called Silicon Flatirons when he was at CU, and he was the Dean of Law School. And for 20 years, policy efforts have been made, not by the federal government, but sort of bottom up, to get our infrastructure in the United States around telecommunications and broadband to be equitable, to be broadly distributed. There is no technological challenge here. It is purely financial incentives. And I have only harsh negative words for the incumbent telecom providers around this, because they are completely driven by the financial incentives that exist. And the US government has not put financial incentives in place to generate that kind of equity over the last 10 years. It's, of course, if you pay attention to that stuff, you read lots of noise about it. But if you actually dig down into it, the mere fact that it doesn't exist is key. By the way, that's not just federal government, but state governments. So I would put a heavy load on the New York state government as well in terms of not creating the right incentives. And on top of that, there was no trigger. There was no pressure point on any of that until this crisis. So, I believe that we will now see in the US meaningful change in those incentives, which will then generate different commercial activity. But as a country and as a society, in terms of enabling that, we've been pretty pathetic. And that actually makes many of these things much harder in a way that's unnecessary. The interesting counterpoint to that is that the power of the COVID crisis and what people have just gone through, I think across many dimensions, not just in business, but in entrepreneurship, causes people to recognize that, this is not a normative or necessary sustainable phenomena. And in fact, the societal cost of it, not just to the individuals, but to the businesses, is quite high against the investment needed for us to be in a position where 5 years from now, we would never, what you just said would never happen again. And I would say I'm an optimistic, I'm an anxious optimist. I lean optimist, but I'm anxious about it, or maybe an optimistic realist. I don't know what the right joint language is. I don't believe that there are the right pieces in place. I am hopeful, especially from places like academia, there will be very clear research done to help understand what really are the broad costs in a way that then motivates those policy dynamics to create the right incentive. I'll stop with that. That's I just want to go on that. I think, by the way, I have one more thing. I think it's very interesting to see how well-resourced companies, including very entrepreneurial companies, have behaved in this with regard to other well-resourced companies that are not as entrepreneurial. The well-resourced entrepreneurial companies, many of them recognize that issue. When the sort of the comment about them not necessarily providing benefits for their families, I sort of get that stuck in the local business versus high growth entrepreneurial sector, where many of the well-funded, well-resourced, high growth entrepreneurial businesses put a lot of energy into enabling that for their employees because they had the resources to do it and invested in their employees. In contrast, many of the Fortune 500 companies who also were extremely well-resourced put no effort into that. And if anything, kind of put more burden on their companies. And we saw this across some interesting anecdotal, certainly not statistically relevant, but anecdotal movement of employees, where several of our portfolio companies who were hiring, part of the hiring was, as part of us hiring you, instead of a relocation stipend, you can live wherever you are. And we'll give you the equivalent that we would give you to relocate to work on your house infrastructure. So your house infrastructure is more conducive to remote work. We'll give you $10,000 to buy furniture. We'll give you a brand new computer. We'll give you 2 monitors. Oh, your internet sucks. We'll pay for, oh, you don't have good internet in your region. We'll figure out how to get you satellite internet that costs more to set up, right? So again, that dynamic of businesses recognizing the importance and value of that versus waiting for something else to happen, I think needs to be part of the policy motion.
I want to push on that because I think you are talking about the rare and fabulous and generous. I mean, I'm seeing stipends like you can have $400, which isn't going to give you a chair. And so the discrepancy in the generosity of that kind of benefit is vast.
I agree. But by the way, I agree. My point is not, oh, tech is doing this and everybody else isn't. There's a small number of people who are doing this and it has a huge benefit to them. And there's a vast number of companies that have the resources who could do that and are not, and it's having a huge cost to them.
I want to just push one more related. So this is where, who do we think about as the employees? And so again, tech has, and entrepreneurial companies in particular, what we've seen is a trend away from having people be actual employees and more movement towards use of contractors, use of temporary workers. Google has been all over the press with this kind of almost like a 2-tiered system. And we see this increasing over and over. And again, so the lucky employees of generous companies are getting fantastic resources, but we see the rich getting richer, and this kind of, what I would describe as a vast underclass of the loosely affiliated temporary. I'm worried about that.
Diane, I would encourage you to study the data. That is not a new phenomena.
No, for sure it's not.
It is something that goes back to the 1980s. It is very disconnected between what happens when companies get to a certain point versus companies below that point. So I think if you studied companies that are 5,000 employees or less, you would see very little of that are high growth entrepreneurial companies. I think if you study companies that are greater than 5,000 employees, that's when you start to see that phenomena happening. And I would encourage real data there versus the assertion that there's more of that happening.
So I do have some data.
I'd love to see it.
Yeah. And again, huge variation, right? There's huge variation. And I would, to your point, this is a trend that goes back 100 years, right? I mean, this is this separation and creating boundaries around who's an employee and who's not an employee. As I read what's most popular in the entrepreneurship literature, I'm deeply concerned. If I look at all of the things around lean, and those are anti-employment recipes, and that has me concerned. And so maybe that's a better way of phrasing it.
I don't understand that. That feels like a bias too.
Oh,
perhaps.
All right. Chiming in now as panelists. I knew this would be hurting cats, but I'm going to try.
It's good. Isn't that more interesting than if we all just agree with each other all the time?
No, this is good. I just want to get Kathleen engaged into the discussion if she has anything to say. If you don't, that's fine, but I did want to give you an opportunity to opine on this.
Yeah, I mean, the things I would add, but these could be the whole separate conversations, are around other areas of policy where we see inequity. And so I feel like what we've seen this past year are the gaps that get created around caregiving, for example. And so what does that do to women in particular and their ability to fully participate in the workforce there? So I think there's a whole kind of caregiving piece here, not just around children, but around, older family members. And I think we saw that play out this past year. Not that it hasn't existed. It was, again, just kind of laid bare for all of us. And then same thing when we think about, access to healthcare. So I just think some of those larger inequities that exist, we saw them more clearly as a community, as employers, and those are policy areas that I think bear thinking about.
And, one of the benefits of this conference is, the discussion that you're having, that's an empirical question, right? That's one that, Kenan Institute can say like, hey, let's actually test to see if which one of these, pans out. Maybe we can understand maybe the mechanism a little more. So this is absolutely, Brad, this is great. I love this. This is what I try to get in my classes all the time. Anytime you guys want to come to my MBA class and talk, please. All right, so we have a couple of questions from the audience. And so I want to get this one in from Happy Ghosh. She asks, how can you help entrepreneurs, both high growth and local, hire fairly and equitably while operating on limited resources, right? So this is, I think, one of the key questions when you start thinking about talent management with small firms that are bootstrapping just to keep things together. And then on top of that, they're trying to think about equity. So what are some ways that you think that small firms can do this optimally?
And so I have kind of one thing to think about there is just, regardless of size, I would draw all of our attention back to there are hiring practices that help us mitigate bias. And so those practices are available to all of us. And they come down to both the kinds of questions that you ask and the way you structure and the way you use consistency in your hiring process, and backing up a step before that, building that wider, diverse network. So I would just call out those things that are accessible to all of us. Take work, right? It takes time to ensure that you have a broader network. but it's that broader network that will help produce a more diverse pipeline of talent.
I'm going to answer this with regard to the high growth entrepreneur segment, because I don't know, I don't have a strong feeling of how to address local business segment with regard to this. On the high growth entrepreneurial segment, I think step one is for the entrepreneurs, founders, and investors to acknowledge the massive inequity in the existing infrastructure that exists and the hiring dynamics that exist and the networks that exist. There's long been an understanding of gender equity issues or inequity in tech. I got involved and was chair for a decade, founding chair of an organization called National Center for Women in Information Technology, that a woman, Lucy Sanders, who had previously been CTO of Avaya, founded and ran. And it's had an incredible impact from a research perspective on helping both understand what's going on, but also understand how to affect it on the gender equity dimension with regard to computer science and technology. The tech industry as a whole was very slow to deal with that. And really, until the Me Too movement, didn't acknowledge the depth of the gender inequity in tech. And I would say for racial inequity, it wasn't until the murder of George Floyd that the tech industry really acknowledged the even more extraordinary inequity with regard to Black and brown entrepreneurs, founders, and employees, and not just the numbers, because the numbers are the outcome of the dynamic, but the inequity of what was going on, and the bias and or discrimination against and or dynamic. There's an add to the DEI language, which is B, which is belonging. And I think the language around belonging has been so profound for a lot of leaders here. I don't know if people are familiar with Susan Fowler's story in Uber and the book she wrote, which is extraordinary. But it shows that even if a company got HR and DEI policies and is trying to recruit more people that are women or who are people of color or whatever, whatever the sort of focus of it is, if those people then join the organization and don't feel like they belong to the organization, they leave. Yeah. And you don't actually address the problem. And in some cases, you make the problem much worse and you generate even more inequity because of that dynamic. So for me, and for sort of the world I have played in, like, number one, acknowledge. Number two, take an active role instead of a passive role. When George Floyd got murdered, I realized that while my wife, Amy, and I had been supportive of many social justice causes over the years, we were not active participants. I'll speak for myself, not Amy. I was not an active participant in eliminating racism in America. I was a passive participant in social justice. And the shift from being a passive to an active in this context is really important. By the way, it means you're going to make a bunch of mistakes. You're going to say a bunch of stupid things. You're going to feel really uncomfortable. But importantly, you're going to learn. Yeah. And if you're able to approach it with a learning mentality where you're trying to, over a long period of time, actively involved in not eliminating, but in helping eliminate. And that's the third, which is this notion of being an advocate or an ally or an accomplice, also language I like, versus fixing the problem. I learned this from gender equity. As a white male in 2005, when men, and almost all of them were white men, showed up in the gender equity and tech discussion, at best, what they said or did was neutral, and it was often harmful. And within a couple of months, I thought I was reasonably gender enlightened because my parents are equal partners in their relationship, and I'm an equal partner with my wife, Amy, in our relationship. Within 3 months, I'm like, yep, whatever I'm going to say or do, at best, it's neutral. And so from that came language of male advocacy from NC Witt. And today, I think this notion of being an advocate, of being an ally, of being someone who shows up and actively helps, but is not the one fixing or solving the problem, because that has a whole bunch of other implications. I'll end with, we've seen this in tech for the last decade, where time after time after time, men, and almost always white men, show up and actually make it almost impossible for other people to engage in something going forward because of their behavior. And it's not debating. I mean, I like to think that sort of Diane pushing on me and me pushing on Diane, I don't think philosophically we're that far apart in terms of the discussion. It's around the precision of a particular thing. It's trying to dig deeper into that versus saying, you're wrong, I'm right, this is the answer, you should do this, here's how it should be. Eliminating all that and trying to learn and grow and develop those relationships.
I guess, Brad, you made me think about one other thing that I would add to this, which is just to make sure that, whatever you're doing as you're working on your policies and practices around talent and working toward diversity, equity, inclusion, and I'm so glad you said belonging. I think look around the room and look in the mirror, and if you find that you're having that conversation and doing that work, and it's a bunch of white women sitting in the room trying to figure this out, then you got to start there. And I'm not suggesting that Black people and people of color need to do the work for us, but I am suggesting that we need to then be active in getting more people to the table to change those practices, because you don't know what you don't know. And those are hard learned lessons sometimes.
But I do think we have some very well-known, well-vetted practices that are not well implemented. So you started to talk about the value of structured interviewing and asking questions that are related to the work that needs to be done. So assessing people, not on whether you like them, but on whether they can do what needs to be done. Well-known technique. Two other techniques just for this hiring that I want to highlight. One is blinding, right? Looking at resumes and stripping out the identifying information that gives away gender, race, ethnicity, right? We have great evidence that this actually matters. We see it in a famous study of symphony orchestras. When musicians played behind a screen, it radically altered the composition of orchestras. I have a young colleague, Sean Fath, who is studying blinding in more general conditions, hiring conditions. We've seen it. Laura Huang did it with pitches, with entrepreneurial pitches to investors. The same pitch with a male or a female name gets evaluated differently, the exact same business opportunity. So this tool of blinding is a powerful way, if someone can let people evaluate credentials without demographic identifiers, we know it makes a difference. The second thing is to acknowledge we're biased. Okay, we're biased. We're probably gender biased. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to pick the top 3 candidates and then the best woman or the best diverse person. And we'll give you this extra person and to force you to bring in extra, bring in diverse. Even if you don't think of them as equivalent, what we've learned is that the top person competes. And this has been a strategy that business schools have used to diversify their faculty. It's been a mechanism for bringing in huge numbers of women, right? Just saying, yes, great department, you can hire the best 3 people, pick your top candidates, but then bring in the best woman. And that woman competes when given a chance to compete. And so again, this is a really practical, easy technique that can be implemented to diversify that there's good evidence it works.
One other just practical strategy there that Diane, you kind of lightly touched is just looking for competencies over credentials, right? We've all depended far too long on credentials as proxy, but really can we get clear on the competency required for the role and hire for that?
I'll give a quick tactic as well from an entrepreneurial perspective, that is language and nuance around language. There's several of them, but I'll use one. There is a phrase used regularly within entrepreneurship and business generally around culture fit. And you look for people with culture fit. And my suggestion is you eliminate that phrase from your language. The language I use is culture add. You as a business, especially a high growing business, have cultural norms. And one of the things that founders get to do is create the cultural norms for their business. But as you grow your business and add people to your business, you want your cultural norms to stay stable and solid, and they'll grow and change and modify. But you want people who will be cultural additions to what you're doing rather than fit within the culture that you have, where you then create and reinforce a monoculture. So just, there's, again, multiple other language like that, but sort of investigating, am I using language that's limiting my ability to not just hire, but actually attract people who don't necessarily identify, again, coming back to this notion of belonging with what the business actually is. And I think in my experience, the companies that have done that, when you look at them, when they're 100 people rather than 10 people, they have wired into their organization this notion of a much more broadly diverse workforce, and a sort of a caring about equity in all the things they're doing with regard to the business.
All right, that was excellent. I think, Happy, you got at least 5 tactics that can be used. So thank you, panelists. All right, we're coming up on about 5 minutes left. So I want to get one more question, and then I want to finish on some forward-looking kind of what things should we be investigating moving forward. So this question comes from Bobby Franklin. Bobby asks, is the pandemic an inflection point for improved entrepreneurial activity in regional ecosystems outside the epicenters, i.e. Bay Area, New York, MA, et cetera? How can we maximize? So I interpret that question as, have we reached a point where we've maybe maxed out in the epicenters, and maybe now we're going to see growth in areas that hadn't historically been epicenters? That's how I interpret it, but if you interpret it differently, let me know. But that's Bobby's question.
I know Bobby pretty well. Bobby's the head of the National Venture Capital Association. So I'll take a crack at answering this. I think this is a phenomena that we are a decade into. And I think it's a phenomena that is hard to see the data impact, because the data both lags the phenomena, and so, current data doesn't actually represent what's happening. It represents what has happened in the past. And a lot of the measurable data doesn't actually really get to what's going on. And I guess there's a third, which is scale, which is that the scale of entrepreneurial activity globally in the last decade has increased by order of magnitude, 2 orders of magnitude, something like that, just a crazy amount, which I think is a very powerful positive thing. I don't think that there is saturation in existing ecosystems. I also don't believe that there is a fundamental competition between ecosystems, notwithstanding the fact that that is a continual mantra of people throughout the world, wherever they live. And I think the reason that the second is not true is that as human beings, we're very used to playing zero-sum games. I win, you lose. My city wins, your city loses. Sports are a zero-sum game. Politics are a zero-sum game, right? We're so sort of wired into this I win, you lose mentality. And my view with entrepreneurship and the growth and development of entrepreneurial ecosystems is a positive sum game. By the way, I used to call it a non-zero sum game. Yeah. I don't know why I got stuck in that language, which is very negative feeling. I just, for a while, that's what I called it. I woke up one day.
It's economist language. It's negative.
I know, but I woke up one day and I'm like, why am I calling this non-zero sum? It's positive sum. Like we're all benefiting. Now, there's lots of negative stuff that happens because it's not equally distributed. It's not equally equitable. Like what's happening in Buffalo, which is versus what's happening in Rwanda versus what's happening in Toronto versus what's happening in Canada abroad, like versus what's happening in Rio. Like it's not equally distributed. It never will be. Mm-hmm. But the spread of that democratization is happening at a pace that's unprecedented, and in a way that's unprecedented, which I think COVID has accelerated, not because of the distribution of work so much as the distribution, the wiring of distributed communication and distributed interaction dynamics. The first stage, by the way, to this democratization was the democratization of information, the ability that somebody in Rio could get information about entrepreneurship by going to this thing called the web or the internet. Like we needed a step, and now we're at another step, which is the phenomena is happening. So back to Bobby's question, is a pandemic an inflection point for improved entrepreneurial activity in regional ecosystems? I don't think it's the inflection point. I think it's a huge amplifier.
Okay.
And I think we're going to have multiple other inflection points because it's not a line. It's this complex system where you have these big step functions, and the step functions aren't stable. You'll have step function, but then you're not going to have steady growth from that step function. It's going to bounce around.
Got it.
To link it back to remote, the nature of work, I think it's a great opportunity to, in those ecosystems, in those geographies, for people on the public side, the private side, the entrepreneurial side, the local business side, to rethink equity in those communities, because entrepreneurship often generates substantial wealth.
Yeah.
But that wealth is highly concentrated. And so if all that happens from the entrepreneurship is you concentrate more wealth amongst few people, it doesn't actually create long-term robust communities. Right. So it's an opportunity for us to rethink that and to build off of that.
All right. Diane or Kathleen, any comments on the inflection point, thinking about regional ecosystems?
Well, so my read of the data is we're seeing a flattening in entrepreneurial activity, and I think the trend report kind of highlighted where we're seeing much more necessity entrepreneurship as opposed to opportunity entrepreneurship. And to me, that's concerning because it points to broader labor market trends about the availability of work and jobs and opportunity. But I love the language of democratization, right? What I am anticipating seeing inklings of, and again, this is from talking primarily to large employers, but also watching entrepreneurial activity happening. We used to be able to engage in a labor market arbitrage and offshore activities or locate activities in places where the labor costs were lower. That's increasingly hard to do. And if we believe that now we can live anywhere, work anywhere, this democratization of wages, so talent needs to be priced. And at the moment, we're giving prices that are location adjusted. And as we back away from these location adjusted wages, what's that going to look like? Well, it opens up. I think it changes everything, but it challenges us enormously. I'm seeing large companies be challenged by just the tax complexity of having people in different places. I can only imagine what that's going to do to growing companies and entrepreneurial companies across states, let alone across countries. And so again, this language of democratization, we think about global democratization, that has pretty profound implications for the functioning of the labor market.
Diane, you make me think about, and I won't take a lot of time on this, but you make me think about, some of the work that our team is doing is around how do we get to a place where we have a more entrepreneur-centered or centric model of economic development, right? Because there are so many policies that if you take a look at tweaking those policies, they benefit entrepreneurs and create more opportunity for entrepreneurs. Yes, in geographies, across the country, including, I think about Kansas City, where I am right now, and wanting to see more thriving ecosystems for entrepreneurs in the middle of the country, for example. I think that's just one place where we want to see more thriving communities for entrepreneurs.
All right. And on that positive note, I'm going to bring this panel to an end. Thank you very much. This was really good. I literally have a desk full of notes here, of stickies. Do not be surprised if I follow up with you on things. We didn't talk about it explicitly, but I think we see there's a lot of opportunities for collaborations, thinking about research, policy. I mean, Diane, the thing you mentioned about tax and the tax policy that would best improve this democratization of, like, that's an area that I was just like, oh, I need to go over and talk to some of my accounting faculty, right, and figure this out. So a lot of opportunities, and we will keep this conversation kind of going as we move forward. So thank you all to my panelists. Thank you all for the questions. We got to most of them. We will have a session afterwards for social networking. So if we didn't get to your questions or you want to talk about more, I'll be there. And I invite all of my panelists to come if they can. And so hopefully we'll see you then as well. But now we'll turn it back over to Chris.
Thanks, Kathleen, Diane, and Brad for your amazing insights. And thanks also to Sekou for moderating the panel. As we wrap up this year's Frontiers of Entrepreneurship Conference, I want to thank all the conference panelists and participants. Thanks to our amazing partner universities as well, Duke, Chicago, Yale, UCLA, University of Pennsylvania, and Stanford. I mean, this is a who's who list, and we're so grateful for their assistance. We also want to thank our generous conference sponsors, Ripple, VentureWell, and SBIA, and thank our 2021 Trends in Entrepreneurship Report editors. We've got senior editors, managing editors, associate editors. We'll probably add some other types of editors as time goes on, but they have put in a tremendous amount of work to make this possible. And then also, of course, thank our support team and data sponsors for their amazing assistance. As a reminder, if you haven't downloaded the 2021 Trends in Entrepreneurship Report yet, you can do so by visiting the Frontiers conference website, and we're going to drop the link in the chat for you, just in case you want to do it right now. We'll be discussing the report's findings with the focus of taking a closer look at the topics covered in today's sessions during the networking sessions following the conclusion of the formal conference. So stay on the line if you can. You can find a link to join us in the chat, and we hope to see you there. And before I hand things back over to Greg to close us out, I want to again thank the Keenan Institute team for putting on such a great event. Well done, folks. With that, I'll hand over the mic to Greg.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And really thanks to all the participants, both those that were presenting as well as those that attended. I hope you've all now had a chance to look closely at the 2021 Trends Report and saw the tight connection between the trends and our conference sessions. We're going to really build on this, as I mentioned yesterday, by constructing the conference program for next year around the trends that are submitted by our community of academic and practitioner and policy experts. And it's definitely my pleasure to invite you to save the date. We're going to be back at the Breakers January 27th and 28th of next year. We're already working on the conference. Definitely want you to invite you to send us your trends. As I mentioned yesterday, people ask us all the time how they can be assured of attending the conference. And again, one great way would be to submit a trend that's accepted as part of the report. We'll be sending out more details about submissions in the coming weeks. But for now, thank you all for being here. We really look forward to seeing you next year.